Hi everyone. So welcome back. This is the first in a pair of lectures on the theme of disability, ethics and technology. So these are two lectures where I'm going to be giving you some opportunities and ways of thinking about the relationships between disability, ethics and technology. And the reason that we're doing this is that because your exam alternative, your exam scenario is going to present you with a situation where you are faced with an issue, a dilemma that relates to disability and ethics and technology in some way. And you have got to respond to that dilemma in an informed and reasoned kind of way. So you're not going to know exactly what the scenario is, until it's released. And so we can't go into sort of detail, too much detail about the specific aspects of technology and ethics that are going to be in that scenario. But what we can do, and what we're going to be aiming to do over the coming weeks, is equip you with the tools to respond to that scenario. Remember that we started the year by thinking about theories and concepts as tools for thinking. And so in this sequence of lectures and seminars and sessions, we're going to be hopefully equipping you with the theoretical tools and also the practical tools to respond to the exam scenario when it arrives. So in this first lecture, I'm going to start by just touching on what we mean by ethics and what we mean by technology before we begin to explore how both of those things relate to disability. It's important to say from the outset, I think, that these issues are not black and white, right? It's not the case that technology is simply good or bad, right? It's more complicated than that. And we're going to begin to get to grips with some of that complexity. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about then, or think about, is what do we mean by ethics? So I'll just advance the slide here. So with ethics, we are fundamentally thinking about a few key questions. So questions of ethics are often concerned with the idea of what is the right way to act. So faced with a particular situation, or finding ourselves in a particular situation, what is the right way to act? And importantly, how do we know what we should do? What's our basis for deciding to act in the way that we do? And we've seen this a couple of times recently. So, in Julie Allen's work that we started off semester 2 with, the idea that inclusion was an ethical project because it started with the act of transforming ourselves as teachers, as educators. Julie Allen's work is deeply concerned with what is the right way to act as an educator. So this is a question or a way of thinking about ethics that we're already familiar with. Similarly, when we looked at learning without limits, the key question for teachers there, like Yahi, the case study, was what is the right way to act in the classroom? What is the right way to interact with young people in the classroom? And so often a key concern of ethics circles around, what is the right way to act in a particular situation? And the exam scenario is going to put you in a particular situation where you have to make recommendations about how to act, right? So it's important that you think about this. Questions that can help us to decide what is the right way to act are ones like the second two here. So what do we think counts as a good life? So if ethics is concerned with morals and what we think is right, then a related question is, well, if we have to know what we're aiming at. So what is a good life? How should people be able to live? and then our actions should help them in some way to achieve that kind of good life that they want. So what is a good life? Or what does a person need to flourish in their life? These are other ways of, another way of saying something similar, right? How do we decide how to act? Well, how can we best help somebody to live in a world in which they can flourish? So those are some of the key questions around ethics. What's the right way to act? What is a good life? What does a person need to flourish? Of course, key in all of this is who gets to decide, right? Who chooses? Who's to say what is a good life, right? Who's to say what a person needs to flourish? And that's where some of the tensions and some of the dilemmas about how to act and how to respond to, say, technological advances can really come in. So that brings us to the topic of technology, right? So let's just talk about what we mean by technology for a moment. And I want you to stop for a moment and think about what we mean by technology. So when I say that word, technology, what is the image that appears in your mind? What does the word make you think of? Most likely, it makes you think of some kind of device, right? Like your phone. But it's important to realize that technology is more than just devices, more than just machines. Machines, devices are just one component of what goes to make up what we think of as technology. So there are three elements, actually. The first element is the artifacts or the device or the machine, right? The phone or the computer or the whatever it is. The second element is then activities and practices. In other words, what the device enables you to do. And the third element is context. In other words, the environment in which the device exists and in which activities and practices can and can't happen. So in other words, in order to be able to make any use of your device, right, in this case, your mobile phone, if you want to communicate with somebody in some way, then you need a way of doing that, whether that is by speaking to them or whether that is by sending messages on some messaging platform or another. So those are the activities and practices, but then you need the whole infrastructure that supports that. So you need access to the internet, you need access to the phone network, you need to be able to pay the bill, and so on and so on and so on. So the context is also crucial. And the context is crucial because it often determines what we can and can't do, or what we do and don't do with our artifacts and devices. And we'll explore how that happens in a bit more detail as we move through the two lectures. So we've thought about ethics, right, as concerned with how to act in human flourishing. We've talked about technology as a combination of things, what you do with the things, and the context in which the things exist. And that's going to bring us now to think about a key concept relating to technology, and that is the concept of transhumanism. Okay, transhumanism. And I'm going to draw, as I am here throughout these two lectures, on Dan Goodley's book, right, Disability Studies, that we were using or had been using as a key text throughout the year. And I'm drawing on it here to define this concept of transhumanism. So this is a scholar called Gregor Woolbring, whose definition is cited by Dan Goodley in Ability Studies. So transhumanism. Transhumanism is a way of thinking about the future that is based on the premise that the human species in its current form does not represent the end of our development, but rather a comparatively early stage. So we're quite used to, at the minute, to thinking about humans in in terms of kind of crisis, whether that is, the climate crisis, or, the disaster of Brexit, or all of these things. We tend to have quite a negative conception of what it means to be a person at the minute. In contrast to that, transhumanism is at its heart actually quite optimistic, right? It says things that can get better, that this is not the end of the world, but actually this is an early stage in human development, in human evolution, and that essentially we can keep inventing our way towards a better life. So in other words, to find new ways for people to live a good life and for people to flourish, despite the challenges that face us as a species. So it's quite an optimistic and technologically focused school of thought. But it doesn't have a very easy relationship with disability. So I remind you of what I said at the start, right? It's not a black or white, right? It's not an easy, good, bad sort of scenario. We can't just say transhumanism is good or bad. We can't just say technology is good or bad. It's more complicated than that. And it depends on all of the things that we've already talked about. Concerns about ethics and what's the right way to act and what counts as a good life. Concerns about how new and evolving technologies are taken up, promoted and used. So this is what leads Dan Goodley to describe this relationship between transhumanism and disability in the way that he does. So he talks about this uneasy dance, right? And that points to the complexity of the relationship, the uneasy transhumanist dance between the binaries of disability stroke normalcy, deficiency stroke capacity, essentialism stroke freedom of choice, demonstrates the ethically questionable ambitions of human enhancement when the erasure of disability is implicated. So what he's saying here is that a lot of technologies seem to be motivated by a desire to eliminate disability. In other words, to erase disabilities, it says here. So for instance, prosthetics that fulfill the function of a missing limb, right? Try to eradicate disability. And so some people might see this as a good thing. Some people might see it as a bad thing if it takes away, for instance, from a person's identity, right? If you remove the impairment, perhaps you remove their identity, or at least an important aspect of it. But also it's speaking to those powerful forces which promote ideas around normalcy and being what's called species typical, and the pressure to conform to being normal, right, to being species typical, and the prejudice and discrimination that people might face if they don't match up to that normal, which will only be accentuated by increases in technological enhancement. But there are positives, right? There's also a positive slant on transhumanism, which we will come on to in lecture 2. But for the moment, we'll stick with these concerns. So now I'll try to illustrate a little bit more what Dan Goodley is talking about here. So what you're seeing on the screen now is an image. And on the left-hand side, it starts with a man in a wheelchair. And in the next sequence of 3 images, as it goes across the screen, he's gradually standing up on a kind of walker, like a rolling walker device that supports him as he stands and walks. And essentially the sequence of images is him showing him getting up out of his wheelchair and walking on 2 feet, on 2 legs, like most people do, with the aid of this walker. But where technology comes in with this is that he's not just standing up and walking. He's actually been fitted in his spine with a device which is communicating with his brain. It's sending electric signals to his brain, stimulating his nerves. And that is part of what is enabling him to stand up and walk. So it's not just a case that he's miraculously getting up out of his wheelchair and walking, but there's a very strong technological element here. And the image is deliberately, I think, representative of those images of evolution, right? The ascent of man, the kind of thing where you see a chimpanzee first on the left-hand side of the drawing, and then a caveman, and then gradually moving up to Homo sapiens on the right-hand side. It's very much like that. So this is meant to indicate, progress, evolution, advancement, betterment through technology. But there are a couple of, at least a couple of views that you could take on this. One is that this is just an example of out and out ableism, right? In other words, what is wrong with rolling rather than walking? Why not just stay in a wheelchair and design a world which is more accessible to people who don't walk? So that's one way of thinking about this. Or the other is to say, well, actually, this represents, freedom of choice. This man has been given the choice to stand up and walk, and he has taken it, and that is a good thing. Now, neither of these positions is right or wrong. What you need to think about is, what is your position? Why do you feel that way? Okay, so that's something for you to think about. Is this an example of ableism, or is it an example of freedom of choice in action? But there is the question, of course, of whether there is any really such thing as total freedom of choice or free will, when there are so much pressures on us, commercial pressures to buy stuff, to improve our lives, and as well as, socio-cultural pressures to look and act and appear and behave relatively normally. There's the question of whether we can really exercise freedom of choice, freedom of will in that kind of context. So that, again, is something for you to ponder. Now, in that slide, you saw an image of somebody with an implant in his spine. And the spine is, of course, part of the neural system, right? The nervous system. And it culminates in our brains, right? So that was an example of what can be called a neural interface. So a neural interface is a bit of technology, usually some kind of chip or computer or device, right? A bit of technology that interacts with your brain and influences what it does. So there is a definition here from the Royal Society, which is a prominent scientific organization. And the image that I just showed you was from a report that they wrote a couple of years ago. So neural interfaces. Neural interfaces are devices that interact with the nervous system of an individual. They are electronic devices placed on the outside or inside of the brain, nerves, or other components of the central and peripheral nervous system to record or stimulate activity. So these might be chips or other kinds of devices that simply record, right, what's going on in your brain, or they might modify what's going on in your brain. For instance, like we've just seen, sending electrical impulses to make bits of your body move. And these are very much at the cutting edge of technology currently, but they're going to become more prominent, they're going to become more commonplace, and they do have a very obvious relationship with disability. I will put a link on Moodle to show you how just how advanced some of this stuff is. The link will be to footage of an event called the Cybathlon, which is something that happens every year in Switzerland, and it's essentially like a kind of Olympic Games, but for disabled people using technology. So what you're seeing on the screen is somebody with like a 3D headset that you might have seen for gaming. one of the competitions in the cybathlon is a driving game, like a video game, but it is entirely controlled through thought. So the players, like the man on the screen here, doesn't have any kind of handheld controller. Everything that he does, the way that he plays, is by just thinking what he wants to happen, right? And in that way, he can control the game. So that is how advanced some of these things can become. And you can perhaps imagine the implications for this, with things like driving a car, right? So if you can drive a car in a video game, how long is it before we drive a car or could drive a car like this in real life? Not long, probably. And there are other competitions like powered prosthetics. So legs that have motors in them and also computers to control them. And a whole load of others that you'll be able to see on the link that I share. So do have a look at that outside of the lecture. Really, I'm just trying to make the point that a lot of technologies that we think of as kind of science fiction level are not anymore, right? They are happening, right? Controlling the world through thought, or controlling devices through thought, is a real thing, and it's happening right now. So these kinds of technologies do raise a number of very important ethical considerations for you to think about. So they are firstly changing the nature of embodiment. In other words, changing the kinds of bodies that people have. And that has implications for how we think about what it means to be a human. So for instance, at what stage would it become normal for us to think that mind control of our devices is normal? And having sort of something, a matrix style chip implanted to help us do that, at what point would that be considered normal? Similarly, if we think about advances in prosthetics, it's not going to be too long before somebody runs the 100 meters faster on prosthetic legs than on natural human legs, right? It will happen, and not very far away. And at that point, the question becomes, well, how many people who were born with fully functioning human legs will change, right? Will volunteer to have prosthetic legs instead, so that they can go beyond species typical and run faster than Usain Bolt. Because people will, right? We guarantee it. People will do anything pretty much to their bodies given the chance. So there are profound sort of questions here about the changing nature of embodiment. Alongside that is increased intervention. So somehow this stuff has got to get in us or on us. It's got to be monitored. Perhaps it's got to be changed. Now, what happens if things go wrong with it? Whose fault is it if your mind-controlled car has an accident? Is it your fault as the driver? Is it the inventor's fault of the car, or the software you're using to control it? So there are some very important questions around the increase in intervention, interference basically, or controlling what happens in our bodies that relate to all of us. Related to that, we've got the idea that these technologies are acting within us or on us, right? They are doing stuff in our bodies or in our brains. And that raises questions about who's really in control. Again, what happens if it goes wrong? If something is influencing the way I think, then are my thoughts really my own? Is my intelligence really my own? Right? Are my emotions really my own? Right? So these are all, again, very profound questions that go to the heart, not just disability, but what it means to be human. One of the things that I've talked about so far is the fact that a lot of technologies are designed to try and eliminate or eradicate or fix disability. Another way of saying that is they try to enforce normalcy. They try to make people conform to that idea of the norm. And that then might lead to further prejudice and discrimination if people don't meet that norm in any way. And one step on from that again is the idea of going beyond species typical. So in other words, we might get to a point where rather than just being normal in the sense of having two arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes that hear, 2 eyes that see, 2 ears that hear, there might be a sense that actually if enough people modify their brains and their bodies, that raises the bar. And so what we did think of as normal isn't normal anymore. And suddenly you do need to be able to run faster than Usain Bolt to be considered normal. In other words, you have to go beyond species typical, or you have to have an IQ of 150, which is currently thought of as genius level, rather than 100, which is average, to be considered normal. So there's the concern that if we keep raising the bar, and if you're not normal or not species typical, then the gap between the haves and the haves not becomes even greater. And that again will reinforce prejudice, discrimination, ableism, disableism, and all the things that we've been talking about a lot this year. So there's a range of really quite profound ethical considerations that come alongside these technological developments. We can't resolve these questions. Like I said, there are no easy answers, but what you have to think about is, what is the right way to act when faced with these technological advancements? How do we know what to do? What's our basis for decision making? What does it take to live a good life? What does a person need to flourish? And crucially, who gets to decide, and how are they going to decide that? Okay, so that is the end of this first lecture. And then in the second lecture, we'll continue to explore this concept of transhumanism. And we'll continue to explore some of the ethical issues, and we'll also begin to look at the flip side and perhaps more of the positive aspects that technological advancement might bring.